So let's dive in, shall we? So in this part of the lecture, I'm going to be talking about the games design industry. So I'm going to give you a bit of a quick history of digital game design. We're going to talk about who makes games. I'm going to give you a vocabulary of what it means when I say a game is AAA, indie, DIY, punk, or amateur. And we're just going to encounter some of the critical issues in game development. I know some of you who do this course are interested in careers in game development and related industries, games communication and social media and marketing and things like that. So hopefully you find this interesting and really valuable. If you're really just focused on trying to learn what you need for the third assignment, that's our focus in lecture part 2. So in the really early histories of making video games, arcade video games and first generation consoles game making was also hardware making. If you wanted to make a game, you had to also make the hardware for it. And it meant that the games were both quite expensive to make, but were also quite a skilled thing. You really had to know what you were doing. But some of these arcade machines could make hundreds, if not thousands of dollars a day in some prized locations. So there was also a lot of money to be made, although at a smaller scale. What happened in the late 1970s though and the early 1980s is that people started having computers at home, which allowed the development of computer games to be separated from the development of computer hardware. So you knew that someone had a computer at home which had there were 10,000 of this model of computer at home, so you could make a game for that computer for people to buy, typically via the mail, and play at home. But you were limited by the hardware of that existing computer. So the games remained basic enough for a sole developer. So generally games were being made by a single person who was responsible for art and the game design and programming and everything. And a lot of these game developers hid a lot of Easter eggs in games that are from that era. What really transformed this though was the 1983 North American video game crash, which is also known as the Atari shock in Japan, which was a huge recession in the video game industry between 1983 and 1985. Revenues in the game industry peaked at $3.2 billion in 1983 and then fell to $100 million, a drop of 97% in 1985. Think of that, imagining that happening to any big billion-dollar industry today. This is often attributed to several factors. There was market saturation. There was a lot of game consoles that were out there, but there was also the quality of the games that were being released was really bad. People just kept buying these games. The E.T. game is the main example of this, of a game that was just heavily marketed, but then so bad that it sold almost no copies. But there was also a real pivot from people being interested in console games in favor of personal computers in the home. So this basically ended retrospectively what is considered the second generation of console video gaming in North America, and it didn't end until the release of the next Nintendo game console in 1985. So slowly the video game industry grew back to its former size. In the 1990s, what we saw in the production of video games was increased complexity. The computers that people were playing these games on were more powerful, so games could do more. And in order to stand out, you had to make the most of this increasing computer power. So development teams took the place of that sole developer, and people began to specialize in games design, game engines, game art, and animation. Titles started to cost a lot more to develop, often involving budgets between $1 and $3 million, and developers would partner with publishing companies, which was a necessity in order to get games into the brick and mortar retail stores where people were purchasing their games at the time. Basically, so basically, the important thing there is that what we're seeing is a lot of people taking cuts, right? So you've got the publishing companies taking a cut, the brick and mortar store is taking a cut, the financier is taking a cut, the person who's paying that development budget is taking a cut. So it's really transforming the kind of nature of games that are being made and who's involved in making those decisions, resulting in a very risk-averse industry. By 2005, a mainstream console video game cost up to $3 to $6 million to develop, with as many costing as much as $20 million, right? So it's very risk averse because of the scale of these budgets. But what happened in the 2000s is middleware tools like Unreal Engine made it easier to develop games. Unreal Engine basically provided you with the physics of your game world, meaning you didn't need to start from scratch building a game engine when you wanted to develop it. At the same time, digital distribution platforms like Steam made it easier for anyone to sell games and keep a larger share of the revenue. In 2008, if you sold a game in a retail store, you would keep about 17% of the retail price. In contrast, selling it online, direct to consumer, you would retain 85%. So that has been a really big transformation in the difference between game development in the 1990s and early 2000s and game development and selling today. From 2008 onwards, though, the next big shift was in mobile markets. The App Store and Google Play Store have totally transformed the games market, really reducing the complexity that is expected of new games. But alongside this, we also saw game development engines like Unreal Engine, but also Unity, making it easier for small teams of developers to make games, which are comparable to what would have required large teams only a few years prior. During this time, we also saw the popularity of alpha or beta game development, where someone might develop a game and release it in alpha, possibly selling it on sites like crowdfunding sites like Kickstarter, with the promise of raising enough money at the start to eventually finish the game for people to be able to buy now but enjoy the full game later. Other examples of small games that were really popular are Banished. This was a game that's developed by a sole developer and sold over 1 million copies with about $30 each. And Untitled Goose Game, which has sold nearly 3 million copies now, has been an enormous success and was developed by a core development team of 4 people based in Melbourne. So what's kind of going on is we're seeing the shift, right? Initially, where we had sole developers because games were so simple, moving towards large development teams because games became complex and games were really pursuing graphical complexity and making the most of the computer hardware that's available, towards all of these tools and new distribution platforms which enable smaller teams to make more interesting, perhaps more riskier games because of the smaller budgets and appealing to a wider audience. To give you an idea, Unity game development company has 5.5 million users as of 2016, but we also recently had an IPO in September and valued the company at $13 billion. I guess a really good example of these smaller games that are making a lot of money is Minecraft, created by a single developer in 2009 as a public alpha with a full release coming later in 2011. Microsoft bought Minecraft for $2.5 billion in 2014, and it's the best-selling game of all time, with 200 million copies sold and 126 million monthly active users in 2020 for a game from 2009. The latest shift that we've also seen is away from these blockbuster releases like movies towards a model of freemium games as a service. Grand Theft Auto 5 is perhaps one of the last massive blockbuster games, right? Earning $1 billion in its first 3, but has changed to a game as a service model, having another $5 billion as an online multiplayer game with kind of freemium microtransactions. The other comparable game is Fortnite, a freemium game which had $2.4 billion in revenue in, I think that should be 2018, the most annual revenue of any game in history, right? So we're shifting now from a model where games are made to be purchased once to games that are made to be played for a long period of time with ongoing streams of revenue. It's notable that we haven't had a new Grand Theft Auto game since Grand Theft Auto 5 has been released because the old game is just still so popular. So what's next for making video games? I think the next big thing in video game development, which is really going to shift who is making games and what those games kind of look like, is cloud gaming. Got a lot of emerging services like Stadia, xCloud, and Luna, which offer basically the ability to play games remotely. So no need for a really powerful computer or a console at your house. That's all sitting in the cloud. And then you stream that that game to your phone. So what's this going to mean, right? games are going to become so much more complex because they've got much more power to work with. We're no longer constrained by what computer hardware people already own. The subscription service is also extremely profitable and is going to allow kind of possibly bigger games, but also maybe hopefully riskier game development. And then if we couple that with the mobility and the ease of access of mobile gaming, which we've already talked about in this unit, with the complexity and long-term appeal of PC games, are we going to see just a huge expansion in who is playing games when we're reducing these barriers and the types of games that the broad amount of people are playing? I think that's going to really shake things up over the next decade. So who makes video games? So the stereotype about the gamer as a young white male definitely holds true in the game development industry. This is from the Independent Game Developer Association Developer Satisfaction Survey, which provides a snapshot of the industry, with respondents self-identifying as generally quite educated, but also quite young. 30 to 34-year-olds making up 20% of the sample, 25 to 29-year-olds making up 17% of the sample. 71% identify as male, with only 24% self-identifying as female. So we've still got the people who are making games is reflected by that gamer identity idea. And we'll talk a little bit more about some of the reasons why game development is a young man's game at the moment. So Brendan Keogh notes that the contemporary video game industry is popularly imagined as a homogeneous site where large international studios pour millions of publisher dollars into technologically advanced blockbuster experience. But this isn't the case. Video game development is really diverse. There is your AAA games like Grand Theft Auto and Fortnite, which make an enormous amount of money. But we're also increasingly seeing indie, mobile and casual games making a lot of money, but not involving millions of dollars of development costs, right? Untitled Goose Game, Banished, Minecraft. But then we can look beyond that to really understand what is making video games in the games design industry into things like DIY games, which are much smaller, and punk games, which aren't really intended to be games in a traditional sense, but employ the mechanics of games and game design to do really interesting things, but are not organized around an economic activity. And so if we think about games not as an industry, but as a form of cultural production, we can have a much richer perspective of the industry. So just to kind of cover these concepts, AAA games are generally risk-averse, following really conservative game design principles. To give you a sense, Red Dead Redemption 2, which came out almost 2 years ago now, had 2,000 employees and cost more than $100 million to make. The innovation that they do push is technological innovation, more realism, packing better graphics and more realistic game environments into existing limited hardware. Under the oversight of an international publisher with a huge number of employees, released on the most up-to-date console only, and it's a very small number of AAA studios that make the majority of the profit. In contrast, independent games are generally individuals or small teams in response to corporatized, homogenized, product-based industry. Following the global financial crisis, a lot of the large game development studios collapsed because they weren't able to seek funding to support themselves. In Australia, in particular, the changing exchange rate, whereas before the global financial crisis, Australian dollar was quite weak against the American dollar. And so this meant it was cheaper to kind of get an Australian studio to make your game than it was to get it made in America. When that changed, a lot of those big studios collapsed. As a result, a lot of these kind of skilled game developers started working on their own games in smaller studios. So independent games isn't just to speak of the games themselves or the experience of gameplay, but rather the culture of game development from when they came. They're not part of these international publishers, they're not connected to international publishers, they're not risk averse, and the game development is being driven not by economic and market concerns, but by the interests and creativity of the game designers. And we can see this in the kind of ideological opposition to mainstream in independent video games that really focus on independent, alternative, individual, liberated, expressive, and artistic means of cultural production. Now, and this was also enabled, as I kind of overviewed in that quick history, by digital distribution. Stores like Steam, but also Xbox Live, PlayStation Network, the App Store, stores like itch.io, indie games still sell heaps and heaps of copies and can become incredibly successful. But we're also recently seeing the rise of big indie. Fall Guys is an indie game that quickly sold 2 million copies after release. It has 230 employees. It still frames itself as an independent game, leveraging the affordances of digital distribution and not needing to be kind of funded through these large international publishers. So indie has now kind of since become a look genre rather than definitively saying something about the kind of ideology or working conditions behind the game. Indie and DIY game design is the majority in Australia. There are some large development studios. EA has a studio, World of Tanks has a development studio, and the game LA Noire was developed in Queensland. But but indie and DIY is the majority, and this is the dominant type. But it's also incredibly precarious and economically high risk. This is a high risk, high reward, talking about some of those numbers before. There's very, very little support for game design at a federal level in Australia, but the state of Victoria provides a lot of support and is now more than 60% of the Australian game industry. So if we're thinking about then AAA games as being kind of the big blockbuster movies, and then indie is equivalent to independent films, much more creative, lower risk, a lot more innovation, capacity to make a lot of money, but also being high risk. We've also seen an increase in DIY, do-it-yourself games that derive from a punk or anti-capitalist consumerist ethos. These are people who have access to the tools to be able to make games, but aren't doing it primarily as an economic activity, but as a kind of creative endeavor, as we see in every other art form. And in tandem with this, we're seeing these DIY games opening up game design to a wider range of individuals, marginalized or otherwise. Game engines like Twine and Game Maker, and increasingly Unity, with so many tutorials, and require a lot less literacy to be able to just jump in and start making games. And a lot of publishers like itch.io, which are much more open. Even Steam, you have to get greenlit to be able to sell on the platform, but itch.io, you could develop a game today and have it selling to people tomorrow. And throwing back to the week on serious games, this means that we're increasingly seeing these games doing things that other games can't do or deal with, that AAA games can't because they're so risk averse. Anna Anthropy, the author of The Rise of the Video Game Designers, has written a lot about their experiences. Has developed games that we played in the Serious Games Week. So if we're kind of contrasting then from maybe these AAA, indie and DIY, the last category I think that's worth unpacking is punk games. Right? Zoe Quinn writes, "So what if it isn't fun? Who gives a shit if the game is openly hostile to you as a player?" Maybe that's the entire point. Maybe we should stop expecting conformity to a suffocatingly narrow status quo. Deliberately confrontational work has just as much of a right to exist as games that make you feel good, and we need to make room for them. The traditional value system around games as a product to be consumed has shifted our focus away from creators and their vision to what will test well with the people who will buy your product. When the dominant narrative in games is intrinsically tied to capitalism being a good businesswoman, we become risk averse. So punk games are also about trying to explore what does it mean if we're making games that aren't meant to be easy to play or fun to play or attractive to play. If the purpose of the game that we're making isn't to sell copies but to do something else with this art form. And I think that's probably where a lot of the most exciting things are. Ultimately, making games isn't fundamentally an economic activity. There's a real counterpoint to the fact that there's just too many video games. What are we going to do? There aren't too many indie developers. But it's not, making games isn't something that you should always be making money out of, and that's kind of one of the richness of the medium and what's really exciting to me. Another term that's used to kind of apply these is trash games. Games that aren't just designed to make money, but can be silly, janky DIY projects. There's this great Twitter thread by Steve Cook curating 1,000 trash games worth playing in the Pirate Bay bundle, a torrent containing 100 small, weird-free, mostly ignored video games you probably haven't played, were made by over 100 game developers. What Anna Anthropy argues is that limiting the creation of games to a small, exclusive group leads not only to creative stagnation, but also to the alienation of anyone outside that group. Games are designed by a small male-dominant culture and marketed to a small male-dominated audience, which in turn produce the next small male-dominated generation of game designers. It's a bubble, and it largely produces work that has no meaning to those outside that bubble, those not already entrenched in the culture of games. And this is why trash games, punk games, and DIY games are some of the more interesting spaces, because they're not constrained by these kind of constrained to operate within this existing cultural bubble. So what are some critical issues in games development? Games is plagued by a crunch culture. Massive overtime to finish games, usually at the end of a production cycle, a real lack of workers' rights, and very few unions for people working in the video game industry. To finish off Red Dead Redemption 2 on time, teams are working 100 hours. And developers have been working overtime for the majority of this year to get Cyberpunk 2077 out on time. Crunch at Epic Games was described as being especially vulnerable for young people. This is an industry where a lot of people want to work in games design. An oversaturated market, and people willing to work incredibly hard to kind of rise to the top. But ultimately this leads to the really young workforce, as people realize that why should they be working so many hours for so little pay when they could take those game design skills that are applicable in film industries and other software development industries and get paid a lot better in a lot better working conditions. 51% of the people who responded to the IGDA satisfaction survey said that their job involved crunch, and another 44% reported that they work long extended hours that they don't refer to as crunch. 43% said they were in crunch more than twice in the last 2 years, and 53% said that crunch time was expected at their workplace. During crunch, people reported to be working more than 70 hours a week in a crunch time work period. So another critical issue in game development is the popularity of game engines like Unity. They're accessible, they're low cost, they've democratized software development, and they have millions of users. I strongly recommend, if you're interested in just having a play around, Unity is very accessible and there are great tutorials that will teach you how to use it. But what does this mean for game development when Unity is the dominant dominant development platform? There's a homogeneity, a platformization of cultural production, when the whole games development becomes constrained by what is possible and easy within Unity, as opposed to what is kind of creatively possible. And finally, in his 2005 article, Julian Kuklik writes how game modding is a form of unpaid labor, playber. This was a concept that I talked about last week around locative games, thinking about the work that Ingress players do to generate data that is used in future games like Pokemon Go, but also in platforms like Apple Maps. Julian Kuklik's idea in this paper is a little bit different, because what he's doing is he's looking at modders, so people who create mods of existing games that become very popular. Counter-Strike Go was a mod to Half-Life, and Dota was a mod to Warcraft, and these are now some of the most popular games in the world. Large video game companies enable modding because it allows them to, because they are able to capture the value that's created by modders. They don't need to take the creative risks. Once a mod becomes popular, they can then recognize that and then create their own version of it. In a similar way, we can think about indies as performing a similar kind of labor. They're not challenging AAA, but they've become a site of innovation. DayZ is a game that was a mod to Arma 3, which is a pretty standard military simulator first shooter game. PUBG was a mod to, originally a mod to DayZ, and that introduced the very popular Battle Royale first-person shooter mechanic, which the Epic Games recognized and were able to recreate in their game Fortnite, leading to its enormous success. So Dean Hall, the developer of DayZ, doesn't capture personally get any of that value from the success of Fortnite. Although he did end up making a lot of money. He has several Lamborghinis from the original developer, but we see how the industry as a whole profits from the creative work, or the precarious creative work of modders. And the result is companies like Valve and Epic increasingly becoming platforms in themselves, owning the digital distribution platforms for the games as opposed to being concerned with the innovation and creative work of design. So thanks very much for joining me on this lecture. That's the end of part 1, where we've talked about the video game industry. In the next lecture, we're going to be talking about how to talk about games design and how experiences in games can be designed for your third assignment. Thanks very much.